I'm Christie Aschwanden, New York Times bestselling author of Good to Go, and you're listening to the Physical Performance Show.
And the winner is...
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Physiocrem and Pogo Physio. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll aim to bring you the greatest and latest information and inspiration through our featured guests on all things helping you pursue and perform at your own physical best. We do this through a range of episodes, including featured performers, expert editions, interest editions, and coaches' corners. And on today's expert edition, I bring you a fascinating conversation that I recently had with New York Times best-selling author of Good to Go, what the athlete in all of us can learn from the strange science of recovery. This has been one of the most enjoyable and insightful reads on sports science that I have read and enjoyed for a long time. I devoured the book in 3 weeks and was so excited when I reached out to Christie to see if she'd be happy to appear on the show, and she said yes. Now, by way of bio, Christie Aschwanden is the lead writer for science at 538 and a health columnist for the Washington Post. Christie's also a frequent contributor to the New York Times, a contributing editor for Runner's World, and a contributing writer for Bicycling. Christie's work appears in dozens of publications, including Discover, Slate, Proto, Consumer Reports, New Scientist, More, Men's Journal, NPR.org, and the Oprah Magazine. What gives Christie's work, and in particular this New York Times best-selling book, Good to Go, such credibility is that Christie has been a lifetime athlete herself. Christie has raced in Europe and North America on the team Rosendall Nordick ski racing squad. She's also a lifetime runner and has been an avid cyclist as well. And the crux of Good to Go is really exploring how to eat, sleep, and rest like a champion. Christie approaches the current explosion, or as she terms, recovery industrial complex of products and services that have sprung up across the last 5 or so years. We've all seen the explosion of recovery strategies. There's recovery centers, compression boots, hot-cold baths, cryotherapy chambers, infrared saunas, you name it, we've all seen it and been exposed. And in Good to Go, Christie explores what's known about recovery for athletes across an evidence continuum, from gimmicky right through to the tried, tested, and proven benefits of sleep for the athlete. And in today's conversation, the importance of monitoring your mood day to day, why prioritizing sleep is just so crucial, the reason why we often cling to unproven and debunked recovery modalities, the underlying drivers for this boom in recovery products and services, the perils of getting recovery wrong as an athlete in developing overtraining syndrome. Christie outlines some of the pitfalls of modern sports science research, and Christie debunks just a few of the myths and mistaken beliefs that athletes for generations have held on to around things such as hydrating throughout endurance sports, refueling post-exercise, the use of ice for sports injuries and recovery, the evidence base for and against common recovery rituals such as stretching and foam rolling, and so much more. This is a must-listen to episode, and one that you'll want to share with your training group. Here is my conversation with New York Times best-selling author Christie Aschwanden around her latest book, Good to Go, what the athlete in all of us can learn from the strange science of recovery. Christie Aschwanden, I have been really geeking out over this and looking forward to speaking with you since I first came across your now New York Times bestseller, Good to Go, How to Eat, Sleep and Rest Like a Champion. And I have just finished the read, and it is something that I believe every active person, athlete, recreational or elite, needs to get their hands on. So welcome to the Physical Performance Show, and thank you for your time.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
You know, the obvious question is, why this book? But I think maybe to tie in with that might be to get a little bit of your background as an athlete yourself. Obviously, you're prolific in sports science journalism, but your background as an athlete, you've been avid as a cross-country skier, I believe, as a cyclist and a lifelong runner. So what's Christie Aschwanden's lifeline look like?
Yeah, sure. So I started off as a runner. I started running in high school. I had actually, I'm relatively tall for a girl, and so I thought, okay, volleyball, that should be my sport. And I went out for the volleyball team, and it turned out that I was terrible. I got cut from the team. I didn't make it. And so I went out for cross country because in the meantime, I had met someone on the cross country team, and it turns out that they take everyone. You didn't have to try out. But it also turned out that I was pretty damn good at it. Didn't know that was coming. And so, by the second meet of the season, I think I was on the varsity team and kind of went from there. I went on to run at the University of Colorado in Boulder. But while I was there, I was in a car accident, actually, which was kind of ironic because I didn't even own a car at the time. I was with some friends going to a birthday party, and someone ran into us, and I banged up my knee. And so I couldn't run for a while. And I started doing the exercise bike in the trainer's office for rehab, but I started getting into cycling. And so I ended up actually joining the cycling team at CU. And then the other thing that I did is I met some cross-country skiers, and they taught me how to ski. So I sort of took that sport up in the interim. But anyway, after college, I ended up bike racing pretty seriously on a local team. This was in Boulder. So there's a lot of, top rate bicyclists at that time. And I think that's still the case, actually. It was kind of a hub of great cyclists. And then after that, I actually went to a graduate science writing program. And when I got done with that, I thought, I sort of am not done with sport. And so I started cross-country ski racing a little bit more seriously. And next thing I knew, I was on a pro team on Team Rosendall and traveling all over North America to do that. And then I actually moved over to Europe and lived and raced over there for a while. So I've competed all over the world. I've been an athlete my whole life, not very serious anymore. Don't race much, but it's something that I continue to pursue, just for enjoyment and all of that. So I guess you can still consider me an athlete, just not a competitive one at this time. And
Christie, I think that rich background, years of endurance activity and sports pursuits really seeps into the pages of Good to Go as you get out and about and put yourself through some of the recovery modalities, be it an infrared sauna or an ice bath or a float tank. So I really enjoyed reading your own anecdotes of these. Christie, can we go behind the scenes of why this book? I mean, anyone that's in the space has obviously seen the, commercialization or the advent of, as you describe it, really a bit of an explosion in the recovery industrial complex of recovery products and services. So what compelled you to do the time and the hours and the 223 interviews to write Good to Go? There's a couple of answers to that question. I mean, I think the first one and the most obvious answer to that is that when I look back on my athletic career, recovery is really the thing that I never managed to master. It was something that I never quite got right. I suffered quite a few times from overtraining syndrome. I sort of figured out too late in my career that I am someone who gets fit very quickly, but also is very prone to overtraining. And that actually, for me, the ideal amount of training is much less than it is for other people. And so that's something that, just took me a long time to realize. And I was looking around and, there's a lot of pressure. And I think this has gotten so much worse than it was when I was an athlete, because now we have social media and we have all of these things now, people uploading their own data from their workouts. So there's this opportunity to always be looking around and seeing what other people are doing. And there's kind of this notion that, the best response to poor performance is to train harder and to do more,
When in fact, very often, when training isn't going well or you're not performing well, what you really need is a rest. And I just learned this too late in my career. So in a way, this is the book that I sort of wrote for my former self. It's something that, I wish that I had read back when I was in college. I think my career trajectory would have been a little bit different. So that's kind of my personal reason for writing the book. But then the other reason is that I'm a science journalist by vocation, so I write a lot about science. I write a lot about medicine, and I've done a lot of debunking of bogus things, and I've kind of seen what marketing can do in various arenas. And what I've seen is that sort of in this short period from when I stopped racing seriously and now, recovery has really become a product. It's become something that is the subject of a whole lot of marketing, and it's become something that people kind of do with as much vigor as they do their workouts. And on the one hand, it's great that people are giving more attention to recovery. I think that's absolutely wonderful. On the other hand, what I'm seeing is that sometimes now with all of these products and this pressure to do everything right, that recovery can sort of become its own source of stress. And I think that's obviously very counterproductive. So I wanted to kind of get into this arena and say, okay, what does the science actually say? What do we really know here? Which of this stuff really works? What doesn't? And, if there is a way to optimize recovery, what is it?
Yeah, and you have done a fantastic job of that, exploring what the science says and also debunking a few myths or sacred cows, I guess. So I want to say thank you as a sports physio for your contribution there. It's really opened my eyes on a few things I was curious about. Christie, you're right that when you're an athlete, and you just mentioned, rest things, you weren't doing rest. It was a noun. It was a state of being you hope to attain through just resting. But now it's a verb. It's as an active, as you say, it can be an elaborate recovery of rituals. And perhaps one of my the most poignant things that jumped out from reading the book was the two contrasting stories that you wrote so beautifully about at the end of the book about Mike Finelli and also Camille Herron, who are both accomplished masters athletes now, but as you cite, they're at polar ends of the recovery approach in terms of their training. So can you outline a little bit about these two characters, Mike Finelli and Camille Herron, and how their approaches differ?
Sure. Yeah, I found it so fascinating talking to the two of them. So Mike Finelli is just an extremely accomplished runner. He's been running for, as far as I can tell, most of his life. He's run like a 2:32 marathon. Fast guy, still running fast. I believe he's in his 60s, maybe. Don't quote me on the age. It's in the book. But he is someone who wakes up in the morning, like basically every waking hour of the day is devoted to some sort of thing for recovery. In fact, he even gets up in the middle of the night to take turmeric. When he gets up to pee in the middle of the night, he takes these supplements and he takes salt baths and he does, every single sort of recovery thing known to science and pseudoscience, he has tried and he has done. And then there's Camille, who is also a very accomplished runner. In fact, she just set the world record for the fastest 100 miles on a certified course by male or female, by the way. She's a really outstanding ultra marathon runner. And she has kind of the complete opposite approach. She really goes by feel. She doesn't, fixate on her diet. She sort of thinks, what am I hungry for? And that's what she eats. She's even stopped in the middle of some of these runs to have a beer. So she's someone who just takes a much more casual approach, but one that really, it's not that she doesn't take recovery seriously. It's quite the opposite. But she is someone who really pays close attention to what her body is telling her. She's learned how to read that. And so instead of writing out her training plan, months in advance, she doesn't even do it from week to week. She really pays attention to how she's feeling on that day and makes training decisions and resting decisions based on how she's feeling. So she's sort of someone who's very intuitive about it, whereas he's someone that sort of throws everything at the wall to make sure something sticks.
Yeah, and I really like the example of Camille, pulling out and feeling comfortable with withdrawing from, I think it was the Western States 100 miler, where she just knew it wasn't her day, she wasn't feeling good. And some athletes can feel shamed by withdrawing from a race, but she just seemed to have that wisdom was dialed in enough to recognise her body's signs. I thought that was a fascinating anecdote.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. One of the things that I've noticed is that people who are really good at recovery and really good at this stuff really kind of take an approach that involves sort of like radically like understanding where their body's at and accepting that. So it's like this radical acceptance. So what it means is that some days you wake up and you have a really hard workout planned, or, in her case, she had this Western States 100 run planned. She had been training. She was fit. It looked like a great race for her. But on that day, it just wasn't for her. It wasn't working out. She didn't feel good. She had a hamstring problem that she sort of recognized that she had two choices, basically. She could keep pushing through. She started to feel the hamstring, not feeling good. And she knew, she could have finished that race if she had really wanted to, but she knew that she could drop out on that day, take a week off. I don't know exactly how much time she took off after that, but she took a little time off. She accepted where her body was at that time. And then she went back to it and went back and, set some new records. Had she stayed in that race, and, I think that this is a really common approach that many, particularly endurance athletes, take, which is that, the instinct is to always push through and sort of suffer. I mean, so much of endurance exercise is about suffering, right? And really good athletes are good at suffering. But sometimes, what's really in order is some radical acceptance and just saying, well, this is where my body's at today, and it's just not happening for me. Or this is, I know I was supposed to have a hard week of training and really do a lot of volume this week, but my body just isn't feeling it and isn't taking it, and I'm on the verge of getting sick. So it's kind of, that decision of you can take a day off or take a day easy when you feel yourself getting sick, or you can push on and turn what would have been, 1 or 2 days of rest into 2 weeks of illness. And so I think that, really good athletes learn to accept and realize this.
Yeah, and I mean, I've had 20 years around endurance sports, and as a 38-year-old now dealing with a few body concerns, I feel like I'm only now learning that skill. Why is it that it can take us so long, if at all, that we have this epiphany? Christie, is it just that athletes by nature are driven and it tends to be input equals output, so push harder if I'm not getting the results?
Yeah, I think that's some of it. I think that endurance sports also attract a certain kind of person too. That's probably some of it. But I think that there has been for a long time, this was certainly true when I was a serious athlete, that there was just this culture of doing more and more and more, and this culture that kind of looked down on doing less. If you're really being scientific about it, what you should aim to do is sort of the least amount of training that you can do that will still get you the results, right? There's no benefit to extra training if it's just exposing you to more injury risk or whatever. You want that training to be, creating these adaptations that you want. But I think that there's just been this mentality that, you have to be tough and you have to be doing more, and we sort of look to that. And so I do think that there's a cultural element there, and that's something that can be changed.
Yeah, and you cite the two age group triathletes who were being coached by Matt Dixon. One was doing 15 hours a week, the other I think 25 maybe, and they both became world champions, but off a different training stimulus. So it's a matter of finding out what's right for us individually, I guess.
Absolutely. And I think so much of it is individual. And it's not just individual, like from person to person, but it can change across an athlete's lifetime. There are times when you're under a lot of other stress outside of sport, and that means that your body's ability to absorb stress, to absorb training, is going to be diminished. There's a really important concept that I talk about at length in the book, and that is just the idea that training is stress on your body, but so is life stress. And what we need to do is recognize that these two things are sort of, from our body's perspective, they're similar. They're stressors. They are things that are preventing our bodies from, doing the rest and repair that they need. And so your budget for stress may be different at different times of the year, at different times in your life. There are a lot of working professionals who are also pursuing, like, say, Ironmans and things like this in their spare time. But it can be really easy to think, well, I didn't train yesterday because I had this really long day of work, but you weren't necessarily completely resting that day either. If you were, feeling emotional, psychological, life stress, your body was still undergoing some of that stress. So you weren't actually doing ideal recovery. And so it's really important to this goes back to the radical acceptance, right? To accept and understand and be like honest with yourself of where you're at and what you can take at a certain amount of time. So it may be that those two Ironman athletes who became age group world champions could have each one of them done similar things on different amounts of training, but those were the amounts that were ideal for them at that time. And I think it's really important to sort of have that radical honesty with yourself of what your body can actually take and what you can respond to at that given time.
And that really did, Christie, emerge from the pages, and that is that, perhaps, of all the new current data, metrics, bioanalytics that are available anywhere for any athlete on the planet, there's subjective measures which so often can seem like they're not as good of guide as the objective, cold, hard, raw data seem to trump everything. It's, as you say, if you've learnt anything about recovery through writing Good to Go, it's that the subjective sense of how it feels is the most important part. And you go through and you list the science and the evidence for and against some of the the objective data, but what it sort of boiled down to for me was measuring mood. And you mentioned the Profile of Mood States questionnaire and some of the world's leading sports scientists working with high profile teams that really zero in on this. So can you share a little bit about the importance of us monitoring our moods, and what advice would you give to the recreational athlete who maybe doesn't want to complete a questionnaire every morning?
Yeah, this was really interesting to me because I think I did sort of expect that there would be some physiological measures that would be, more important than they are. But it turns out that, looking at all of the different things people have looked at in order to sort of measure recovery states, amounts of tiredness and all of that really mood is the absolute best one. And it sort of makes sense if you think of it this way. Our bodies are really sophisticated machines. And what's happening here is your brain is taking all available inputs, the physiological, the psychological, all those sorts of inputs together to produce your mood and to produce this qualitative thing of how you're feeling. So the best thing that you can do when you wake up in the morning is ask yourself, how am I feeling? When you get out there on the field or, out there to go do your workout and you're sort of feeling, how is it feeling to me today? That qualitative feel is actually just as good and in fact better than anything that you can measure on a sports watch or in a blood test or any sort of thing like that. And this has been verified again and again. I mean, there have been in the book, I talk about studies that have been done on this. And, for a long time, these sports psychologists that were saying, well, maybe we should look at mood, were kind of poo-pooed a little bit. But eventually, researchers realized that they were really on to something. And in the book, I have a story about this guy from Silicon Valley. He's like a data geek who sort of went through all of this for himself and did all this research and eventually sort of concluded, like these scientists had, that, oh, I don't need all these. He thought he was going to be able to have the magic device. This is someone, who's one of those founders who started companies. And really, if there was a thing to be found by data, it'd be him who would find it. But he eventually concluded that really, he sort of made up his own mood state measure, which was just a numerical rating in the morning, like how is he feeling? And I think that it really is that simple. There are all these things now. HRV is one of them. I mean, these things are interesting. I don't want to dismiss them as entirely useless. They definitely aren't. But the problem is that I think it's really easy, and we're at a time in our culture where this has become very common, where people are sort of looking to the data at the detriment of sort of developing for themselves a sense of their own bodies and a sense of what their bodies are telling them. And so the idea that you're going to learn something new from a sports watch, that's, that measure on your watch, whether it's HRV, whether it's heart rate, if it's something else, those can be informative. They are things that you might pay attention to. And a lot of this is really about learning to pay attention to the right things. But what we see now is that we have athletes who have sort of offloaded the work of understanding what it feels like to be tired, what it feels like to be recovered, what it feels like to be fit. They've offloaded this to the data. And so they're looking to the data and they're trusting the data before they're trusting their own bodies. And I think that's really dangerous.
Gosh, that's powerful, trusting the data versus trusting their own bodies. And, I've observed, I ran for 15 or 12 years before I ever had a GPS watch. And I have a feeling that generation is maybe a bit more attuned to the perception of effort, which we both know is so important as a training factor. And there's Strava injuries. I'm a physiotherapist. I often see Strava injuries, too many fast runs.
Yeah.
So as you say, trusting the data versus trusting the feeling. You mentioned this concept, the McNamara fallacy. Yeah. Not everything that counts can be measured, and not everything that can be measured counts.
That's right. That's right. And I have a friend he's a college running coach, and he actually told me a story the other day. This is hilarious. He actually had some runners. They were doing mile repeats on the track, and he noticed that some of them were running beyond the finish line. They were going a little bit beyond there before they were slowing down and sort of hitting their watch. And he was like, what the hell's going on? Well, it turned out that their GPS watch wasn't showing that they're basically going until their watch showed that they had hit the mile. And so it wasn't that they didn't trust that the track was the right distance, but it was also, they had sort of fallen into this trap of like wanting to track all this data and wanting that, in their training log on the online site and being able to upload that and all of this. And, it just sort of shows the absurdity of it.
It is a great example. I mean, you mentioned the risk of drawing attention to numbers sometimes can be that they're not relevant, and it could be in itself creating a sense of stress that doesn't need to be there. And yet that's one of those very things that you mentioned, that concept of the budget of physical and emotional reserves. It can get to be like that, can't it? Where it says stress or looking at the data.
It can. And I think, I've seen that people start to develop these anxieties too, and they start to develop these senses. It goes back to, me overtraining because I saw that everyone else was training so much. And I think that now that we have access to all these data, people really feel like, okay, I can see what everyone else is doing mileage-wise. I can see what their heart rates are. I can see this, and I need to upload all these things. And people get so sort of transfixed by looking at the numbers, when at the end of the day, no one cares how many miles you trained. They care where you finish across the finish line, right? Did you win the game? Did you win the race? And so you can do all of these things, but you really have to ask yourself whether you're paying attention to the things that really matter. And are you doing this? Are you completing this workout so that you can have it in your log to upload? Or are you doing it because it feels like the right thing and it's giving you the result that you want at that time? And, I think we're at a time when it bears asking much more often than it did in the past.
Christie, I really enjoyed the anecdote of a friend of yours who went from being a recreational athlete, I believe she was a cyclist, doing well, finding training a source of joy and relaxation, going out with her husband, and then she decided to take on a few harder or longer races, and she engaged a coach, an online coach. I think it was a retraining program to prepare her for this longer distance race. And, you then cite that her performances went down. She ceased enjoying it as much, and as opposed to just writing how she felt that day. And it really made me reflect on my own training over the years and sort of liberated me and the approach I've often just gone by feel, mainly through time pressures of not being able to accommodate a coach's recommendations and only running with what I can. I think it's really interesting that sometimes it could be that rigid programs, people are trying to stick to it, and it's a source of the opposite of what the book's about, which is recovering well.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's just so important when you are training to be paying attention to how you're responding and how you're recovering. And you only benefit from training that you are recovering from. And there are times, if you're following a particular program, there's going to be times when you want to be pushing yourself to fatigue. So I'm absolutely not saying that you should never get tired. And if you feel tired, take a day off necessarily, but it's really about sort of paying attention. And, you want to sort of get yourself to that point of fatigue, but then bounce back. And you don't want to dig yourself into that hole.
Yeah.
What's really interesting about my friend, the story you were just talking about, is that it's interesting because it's an example of here something had actually changed profoundly. So, she basically, this is such a typical story that I've heard again and again. So she was someone who was cycling recreationally. She was very good. She was mountain biking. She was a very good technical rider. She really enjoyed it, but she wasn't doing this for competition or to, win races or anything like that. One day she decides to jump in a race, boom, she did really well. She won the amateur category, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, wow, maybe I should really pursue this. And so all of a sudden it changed. It went from being this thing that she was doing for pleasure, for stress release, for fun. And all of a sudden now there was this pressure, like, I need to be good at this. I need to do these things a certain way. I need to follow this training plan. And it turned out that the training plan was probably, it was quite a change from what she had been doing, although the volume of training didn't go up. The intensity did, and that was something new that she wasn't used to. And so that was sort of stressful, and there were days where she just didn't feel like training. And then she did this thing that I think so many athletes do, where they sort of beat themselves up like, well, I must be really terrible if I don't feel like training, so therefore I'm going to force myself to train even harder because I must be just weak.
Yeah.
So she ended up digging herself into this hole, and so much of it just came around to, like, she had gone from the one extreme of just really doing things by feel and because they were enjoyable and felt good to, okay, I have to do this program plan no matter what, and this is what I'm supposed to do, and it doesn't matter if I'm not feeling it. This is what I'm expected to do. And so, I think that there is a happy middle in there somewhere, and where that middle is going to depend on, what your goals are and what you're doing. And of course, athletes at very high levels of sport are going to be training hard and all of that. But it's just important to keep these things in mind, and to also, it all comes back to that idea of stress. Her training all of a sudden became more stressful to her. And I think that's something she just didn't recognize, but it's worth paying attention to. You
mentioned elite athletes such as Ryan Hall, America's fastest marathoner at this time of recording, 2:04 marathoner, prior featured performer of a guest of this show. And I think it's encouraging the story that you share of Ryan. I guess it's probably a harsh word to say his demise of his performance, but I guess on paper that's what it was. And I guess it's encouraging to many recreational athletes to know it's not just, the recreational athlete, the weekend warrior that can succumb to not heading their recovery well, but also the sports elite. And, you mentioned Ryan. What, were you surprised by Ryan's story?
I wasn't surprised. I mean, I don't think that it's that atypical. I think it's something that, we see in a lot of less elite runners and less elite athletes. But I think, in the end, I think one of the people I quoted, who knew him and had trained with him, said, his greatest strength was also sort of his ultimate downfall. And that was that, he was never going to be satisfied with, doing anything less than his very best and pushing. And he was someone who just had a really difficult time, taking those days off. And he told me, his coaches had told him after the marathon that he needed to take a little time off and recover. But instead he had this attitude of like, well, I got really fit for that race. And like, why would I want to waste that fitness? If I stop training for a week or I give myself a few weeks of downtime, I'm going to lose all this fitness that I worked so hard to gain. And, I think he realizes now and in retrospect that wasn't the thing to do. And in fact, he says as much. I quote him saying that, in hindsight, he wishes he could go back and do that, take that time off and give himself a rest. But I think that that's a really common thing that people do. And particularly this idea that, once you're sort of at peak fitness, that you need to keep riding that and that you want to keep going with it. But the fact is, your body, again, always needs that recovery. And so if you're skimping on recovery, you're not only not going to maintain, that peak, but you could actually, push yourself back to a lower starting point.
Yeah, and I chuckled when Ryan, you quoted Ryan as saying that he never felt at ease resting. He was a relentless striver to the end, and if he could do it again, he would take 2 weeks of vacation after every marathon, in his words, to get fat and out of shape, and then, to go again to absorb the next batch of training. And I guess, Christie, this is all to avoid that overtraining state, which one of the things that jumped out is one of your sources, Carl Foster, who suggested that perhaps we start to change the terminology away from overtraining syndrome to unexplained underperformance syndrome, or WPS, to take the emphasis off training and start to put it more on factors that might be obstructing recovery. I thought there was a lot of wisdom in that.
Yeah, I agree. And that's definitely a movement that's underway to sort of rebrand that, because it is, the UPS actually stands for unexplained underperformance syndrome, like you mentioned, or UPS. But it's really getting to this idea that you're underperforming performing, and there's something there. The sort of latest thinking on this is not that it's not the training itself, it's the recovery that's underlying this. So the idea here is that there's not really a such thing as overtraining. There's only under recovery. So as long as you're responding to and recovering from your training, train as much as you want. It's only when that recovery is not happening and you can't keep up with the recovery that you have to back off. And that, again, that ability to absorb the training and to bounce back and to recover from it is going to vary not just from individual to individual, but from individual, from one year to the next, even during different parts of the season. I mean, this is why, early in the season, you're not able to do quite the same hard workouts that you are later in the season. First you build a base, and there's a very deliberate way that people go about training, and for a reason.
You're listening to New York Times best-selling author of Good to Go, What the Athlete in All of Us Can Learn from the Strange Science of Recovery, Christie Aschwanden, on this, an expert edition. Today's episode is brought to you by PhysioCrem. PhysioCrem is a topical massage cream containing natural plant-based ingredients, ideal for the temporary relief of muscular aches and pains. If you're conscious of what you put on your body, you'll be happy to know that PhysioCrem does not contain parabens or hydroxybenzoates. Its non-greasy formula doesn't leave any sticky residue behind either. PhysioCrem can be found Australia-wide at your local Coles, chemist or health store, as well as their online store. They've even offered a 20% discount for listeners of the Physical Performance Show by simply using the coupon code POGO, P-O-G-O in capitals, when you shop over at physiocrem.com.au. Hurting sucks, and PhysioCrem have got your back. Today's show is also brought to you by Pogo Physio. We exist to help you get back to your physical best following injury. Our philosophy is very simple. We want to ensure everyone who walks through the doors of Pogo Physio completes their rehabilitation, gets back to their physical best, and in doing so crosses what we term the physio finish line. Now, to get you there, our approach is simple. We do not want to see you for a single session more than what you require or a single session less. We just want to ensure you get back to your physical best and enjoying the things that you love to do. To find out more about Pogo Physio's award-winning services, or to schedule your 1-hour initial appointment, or explore our online physiotherapy consultation options, jump over to pogophysio.com.au. For now, let's jump back on this expert edition with New York Times best-selling author Christie Aschwanden on all things the strange science of recovery.
Christie, you cite a concept of the evidence continuum when it comes to this explosion of recovery products and services. You say on one side is sleep, the one potent and free, perhaps best form of recovery, and on the other side is a bunch of faddish products. But many of the current recovery modalities that the world would now recognise and have access to, the Western world, you put in the middle, promising but unproven. So can we explore a few of these modalities and maybe debunk a few of, the commonly held myths?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the most common ones, and I devote a whole chapter to it, is about icing. And now we have cryotherapy, which is, people are going in, they're often called cryosaunas. So you basically stand naked in a big metal vat, and they, release some gaseous nitrogen that's very, very cold. The temperatures get extremely cold. And the idea here is it's going to reduce inflammation and speed recovery. But it actually turns out that icing and cold, whether this is being delivered through cryotherapy or just a bag of ice or an ice bath, that icing isn't actually helpful for recovery. And in fact, it may actually be detrimental. And the reason for that is that inflammation, so icing does temporarily reduce inflammation at the site that's being cooled. But inflammation is actually really important for recovery and for repair and for injury repair as well. And so, you can think of it this way: when you're icing an area, let's say your knee or your legs, what you're doing is basically, by making that area cold, you're reducing blood flow. When you're icing your extremities, your body shunts all the blood to the core. So you're reducing the blood flow there, but the blood flow is what's going to get all of these agents to the site that needs repair. So instead of expediting recovery, it's actually slowing it down, and it's slowing the recovery process. And there's pretty good evidence for this now from multiple studies in different contexts. And what's really interesting to me here is that there are a few studies that do suggest some beneficial effects. These benefits are almost always things that are qualitative. So you ask people, like, how sore do you feel? And so they aren't things that are as quantitative. So there's there are things that are very suggestible and subject to the placebo effect. And so one of the studies that I thought was most interesting, so many of these studies you can't do with the placebo. I mean, we can't give one group fake ice, right? Like, if you got ice or not. And so the ice group will have some expectation that something's going to happen. But this study did something kind of interesting. They actually had what's called an active placebo group. So instead of having the other group do nothing, they gave them a fake cream that was supposed to reduce soreness. And what they found is that the benefits were similar with the fake cream as they were to icing. And so what this suggests is that it's the suggestion and sort of the idea or the placebo effect that's really responsible here for the benefits that you're seeing.
Yeah, and let's explore placebo in a moment. With the icing chapter and your exploration of cryotherapy as a recovery agent, Christie, I must say thank you, because as a sports physiotherapist 13 years into my career, I never really understood it. If you just thought about it, like, we've got this beautiful inbuilt mechanism to repair the body through, why would we want to delay that? And so you really liberated me in that, and I'm like, okay, I've stopped icing. I want to put up a social media post why I've stopped taking ice or doing ice, something funny. But, I had a triathlete that crashed when I was doing my duties recently at a triathlon event, and he came in with a bloodied face and elbow and shoulder, and he looked at me with eyes the size of saucers when I said, I'm not going to ice you, Hayden. And he said, why? And I said, well, I just don't think it's going to be in your best interest. You've got to race again tomorrow. It sort of made me think, why is it that, I appreciate it, but why do we hold so near and dear to some of these things that are now being shown to maybe not be, or to not be beneficial at all, such as icing? What are the underlying drivers there?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I found while researching this book, I mean, I read probably close to 1,000 research papers, in the scientific literature about this stuff. And one of the things that I found is that so much of what we do in sport is just, tradition and things like this is how we've always done it. Icing is one of these things, and there is a theory behind it. It's not. It wasn't just something that someone made up, but we have good evidence now that it's not helpful. But there are a lot of things that are just. I think stretching is a good example of this. It's something that we've always done. This is what we do. This is how we do it. And there isn't a lot of thought given to, like, do we really know that this works? What is this actually doing? So like in the instance of stretching, I mean, I remember when I was a high school runner, I was team captain, and before at practice, we would start each practice by doing this whole set of stretches, and it was very ritualized, and some of them were partner stretches, and we would do one after the other in this particular order, and it served a really good purpose. Actually, it was a kind of a team bonding experience. It was a way to sort of start off the workout in this social way. We're all talking while we're doing this and sort of enjoying each other's company. So it's not necessarily something that wasn't serving a role, but in terms of all the things that I was told that it was doing, like reducing injury risk and making you less sore later on. It turns out that just doesn't pan out. The science shows that it doesn't work that way. Stretching will make you more flexible, but beyond that, it really doesn't have a lot of benefits, and it certainly isn't something that is reducing injury risk. We know that from some pretty large studies now. But people really like it, and they swear that it works for them. And this gets to another important concept, which is that people's personal experience is very, very compelling. So a lot of people really like stretching. They know that it works for them, but most of them haven't actually done the experiment, right? Like they haven't gone without doing it. So they know that certain things have happened or they feel a certain way, and so they attribute it to the stretching, but they can't go back and do the experiment again where, okay, what would have happened if I hadn't stretched before that race or after that race or before that workout or after that workout? We don't know. So we're sort of over-attributing our personal experience and sort of overgeneralizing it. And that's why we need scientific studies to understand what's really going on.
Christie, we cling to these unproven practices, if you like, and now debunked modalities, some of them, even in the face of the evidence, because we know what we believe and we won't be dissuaded. As you say, the power of our own experience and our beliefs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the belief's just such a powerful thing.
And I'm with you. I haven't stretched for 10 years, and some of my running buddies think I'm nuts. Aren't you the physio? Yes, I am. And as you say, the only thing that's changed is it saved me time.
Exactly.
I had to laugh. Christie, one of the things I found really fascinating was the hydration. The pages you dedicate to hydration. You cite people always worrying that they're going to become dehydrated, when the reality is, it's potentially much easier to be overhydrated or potentially in this state of hyponatremia. So, gosh, I found this chapter interesting. Can you speak briefly to what you discovered about hydration?
Yeah, it was really pretty surprising to me, actually, because like everyone else, I'd had it beaten into my head that hydration was such an important thing, and it was this sort of performance limiting thing. And if you didn't get it exactly right, like everything was going to go to hell, and you wouldn't perform at your most optimal, level. But it turns out that, look, hydration's important. It's not unimportant, but it's not nearly as important as we've sort of been told. Our bodies are actually very well adapted to, losing some fluids through sweat during exercise, and you don't need to replace every single drop of sweat in real time. And it turns out that actually the very best way to address hydration is to drink to thirst. It sounds really simple, and it is, although I think we're at a time now where people have completely lost, touch with what it feels like to be thirsty. I mean, we're always drinking all the time and told that we're supposed to be drinking all the time. And this isn't just for sports. Now we have the bottled water people, telling us we have to drink all the time and certain water is better and antioxidant water and all of this stuff. But when it comes to sport, hydration is important. It's not nearly as important as we've been told in terms of like getting it exactly right. If you're thirsty, you need to drink. If you're doing a long distance event, particularly in the heat, excuse me, if you're doing a long distance event, particularly in the heat, you need to think about this and you need to plan and make sure that you have access to fluids when you might need them and when you might feel thirsty. But it's not necessary to replace this all every moment at a given time. There's also a lot of talk about electrolytes. Well, electrolytes, that's just a fancy word for salt. We get these salts through our food that we eat all the time. You don't need to put them in a sports drink. But that's brilliant marketing on the part of the sports drink industry, because people really do believe that electrolytes are these special chemicals that they can't get anywhere else. But the thing that's really tragic here is these ideas about hydration that have been, brought to us by these vested interests have actually created a situation now where people are dying. They're literally dying in athletic events because they're drinking too much and they're drinking beyond their thirst. And usually this happens when someone's, has decided that they're going to drink, a certain amount every hour or every whatever. And sometimes this is even based on some of these, hydration charts. There's all kinds of different advice about this out there. While I was working on the book, I looked very hard. I really wanted to sort of make this contrast of people who had died of dehydration during an event versus people who had overhydrated. Well, it turned out I wasn't able to find a single case of someone dying of dehydration during an athletic event. I could find, media reports where dehydration was cited, but then when you would go to sort of, the second day report or the medical report or the final autopsy or whatever, it was always heat stroke or some other thing. And in fact, some of the ideas about hydration really started out around heat. And so the idea was like, how can we help athletes perform better and tolerate exercise better in the heat? And so while it is true that, in the heat, hydration becomes more important and, you're going to get more thirsty when you're exercising in the heat. Being hydrated doesn't actually protect you from heat stroke or anything like that. There's some pretty big studies, good studies from military situations, actually, with a lot of people. So, good studies showing that most cases of heat stroke don't actually even have hydration associated with them. So it is true that dehydration can be a risk factor, but that's rarely a major one. And in fact, this very large study that was done in soldiers found that only something like 20% of heat stroke cases had dehydration even associated with them, not even as a causative factor.
Yes.
So I think the takeaway here is just that hydration is important. Like, drink when you're thirsty. Make sure that you have access to fluids. So I'm definitely not saying, like, go out and do your marathon. Don't worry about it. Don't drink anything. You need to think about it. But drink a little if it tastes really good. We've all had that experience on a hot day where you drink a little and it tastes really great and you want to have another glass. I mean, that's thirst. That's what we're talking about when we're saying drink to thirst. And, your body will tell you if you don't need that liquid, it's not going to taste good. You're not going to have that sort of natural impulse to keep drinking. And this, again, goes back to sort of our previous conversation about, you can outsource these decisions and these things to some data point, some company that's trying to sell you something, or you can learn to read your own body and really be in tune with what it's telling you. And that is just absolutely the better approach here.
Yeah, that trust your body. A psychologist recently shared with me that our body never lies. I think there's so much wisdom in that. And, I think it's important for endurance athletes through your writings to not be afraid of dehydration, as you cite. The best performances, sometimes these elite athletes finish 4% lighter with the amount of dehydration, but their body's been able to deal with it. They've drunken to thirst. So thank you for
my understanding is that the woman who won the London Marathon this year didn't drink anything. Now, I haven't been able to confirm that, but I've heard it multiple places. There are several examples too of world records in the marathon being set by people who, by some standards, there's a standard advice that you don't want to lose more than 2% of your body weight during an event through, sweat loss. But, under those kinds of circumstances, there have been some really fine performances put in. So I think this idea that you should weigh yourself and match that weight with fluid intake afterwards is not good. And I think, the science has really overturned that. So that's dangerous advice to give.
And Christie, beyond hydration, you explore, refueling with protein and different foods. You explore supplementation. And really one of the themes that emerged from your exploration in the pages of Good to Go on those topics was that a lot of the outputs in the scientific literature are studies that maybe aren't, as you cite, on scientific quests for truth, but rather marketing exercises designed to sell products and services. You mentioned some of the limitations, predatory journals, only wanting to publish positive findings and results. It really made me think about, just because it's validated in the research, a paper that's published, it doesn't necessarily mean it has legs and is necessarily a best practice. So for the listener, can you share a little bit about how caution with regards to interpreting what might have a little asterisk next to it, scientifically proven?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I hope if there's one thing that readers come away with, I hope that it will be, a better understanding of how scientific research works and how to assess scientific studies. I mean, I get into a lot of this in the book, obviously, but I think it's important to realize that so much of the science that's being done in this field is actually, just exercises in marketing. You have companies that are looking for claims that they can, support with a study. And so they will say, we have this product and we think it does something, let's go prove it. Well, that's the opposite of, how good science is done, which is, you may go in with the hypothesis, but you are not designing studies to show that, you're almost doing it the opposite. You're trying to disprove it as a way of, showing that it's a rigorous idea. But there's several problems in the scientific literature with a lot of these recovery studies. One is that they're almost universally very small sample sizes. It's very typical to have studies that are like 12 people, and you just can't get reliable evidence, reliable data from such small studies. You can't. It's like, you can get interesting ideas, you can get hypotheses to test further, you can sort of generate ideas, but these are not things that can give us definitive proof about anything. And so we've really gone sort of beyond the evidence for a lot of these things, and it's very easy for people to do these studies and then they're taken at face value, when in fact we need to sort of take all of the evidence in its totality. We do have this problem, like you sort of mentioned, of it's called publication bias. So if I told you that there are 3 studies showing that this product really aided recovery, you'd think, wow, 3 studies, that sounds pretty good. This must be really great stuff. But if I told you that there had been 12 studies and only 3 of them had positive results, now all of a sudden the evidence doesn't seem as exciting, right? But that's exactly the situation that we have, where we have a lot of research that never gets reported and never gets published because the results weren't positive and they didn't show an effect. And oftentimes, the researchers are thinking, well, that study didn't work, instead of like, okay, what is this telling us about, the state of nature and how the world works? And when you're doing research for marketing purposes, it's really easy to get stuck in that loop of doing research to prove points instead of doing research to understand the world and to seek truth. And there's just a lot of research in this area. Particularly, there's a lot of funding from industry, whether it's supplements or sports drinks or whatever. I mean, Gatorade has what they call the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. And the idea that, you'd have a company, calling themselves a science institute to do marketing research is just really interesting. But, they fund a lot of good researchers, and those conflicts of interest are problematic.
And I mean, as consumers, it's compelling. These are big brands. They've got ambassadors, well-paid athletes, aspirational identities. And then you also mentioned, which I can really resonate with in anything in life, but it's that fear of missing out, whether we're recreation or elite. Our friends doing that. We want to be doing that. Perhaps we're not getting the best out of ourselves if we don't do that. Christie, being conscious of our time, you look at other modalities, which we won't go into, but massage, float tanks, compression garments. But can you just share about the one thing that, as you say, sits on that real far end of proven, cheap, accessible to all in terms of this evidence continuum, and that's sleep. So what would be a one message to help us better understand the power of sleep as a recovery agent?
Well, I could tell you there is nothing else that comes even close to sleep when it comes to recovery. I mean, it is just hands down so much more powerful than any other thing that you will ever find. It's just, it is literally when our body makes repairs, when it, does all the things that need to be done for recovery. You have surge in growth hormone and other hormones that are aiding recovery and muscle repair and all of this. So, the first advice that I would give to athletes is to make sleep a priority. I mean, it just sort of astounds me the extent to which people will almost brag about how little sleep they get. And, we should actually be doing the opposite. I mean, we should be bragging about how I got 8 hours of sleep or 9 hours last night. Wasn't it great? It's such an important thing. And in fact, this is something that a lot of elite athletes have really picked up on. I mean, in the NBA basketball here in the U.S., naps have just become almost compulsory among athletes. I talk about some U.S. ski team members the same way. And so there are a lot of teams now that are even putting nap rooms in their facilities. The U.S. ski team has one over in Utah, I saw. So these are things that are being adopted, and there's just nothing that you can do for yourself that will aid recovery more than sleep. And then, the second thing, in accordance to this, would be reducing stress. I mean, before you go out and buy all these fancy gadgets, figure out some way to reduce the stress in your life and find some way to, put some relaxation into your day. It's sort of a sad, commentary on our society these days that people have to be taught to relax and that they have to be told that they need to pencil into their schedule like some relaxation time. And yet it seems as though that's where we're at. But there's nothing that most of these products can do that would be anywhere near as powerful as just finding ways to reduce the stress in your life. And in fact, I think that a lot of the things and the gadgets that people like, massage being one of them, although massage has a lot of benefits that are a little bit less tangible, but a lot of them are just ways to take some time out and relax. So you can spend a bunch of money on pneumatic compression boots, but really what they're doing is making you put your feet up for a while and relax and not do anything else and not run around. And so there are other ways to do that are cheaper. So think about that.
The sleep findings make me think of a prior guest, a sleep doctor who shared his mantra, sleep in and win. And I think for the athletic population, we often want to skimp on that hour or two of extra sleep because we need to get our training done before the day starts. And how wise is that? It's such an interesting concept.
It's a huge mistake. And in fact, there are teams now that are changing their practice schedule. I mean, it's dumb to have, 6 a.m. workout if it means that people are not going to get enough sleep, particularly if you're talking about young people. I mean, I know that in a lot of high school swimming programs, it's very common that the kids will go and, do 2 days where they're training at 6 a.m. in the morning and then again after school. And that's just terrible because teenagers, their natural cycle is to want to stay up late. And so it's just, you're doing it at the detriment of their sleep, which is particularly important when you're a youngster still growing and adapting and doing all that. So yeah, abandon sleep at your own peril.
Yeah, gosh. And, time's going to beat us to explore placebo, but I think it's as David Martin stated that placebo, the effects are, it doesn't mean that it's ineffective. They can still be real. They can have been shown in the literature to be as powerful at times as medication or drugs. And I guess that sort of would be my takeaway is that, if people ask me in my profession about recovery agents, I'll probably adopt David's approach and yours, which seems to be that the recovery science may not be strong, but some people find it useful and perhaps, you might as well. So as you say, if it's a chance for someone to forced rest, then it may be serving them well, even though the science isn't there to validate it in full.
Agreed. Yeah, that's a great point.
You're listening to New York Times best-selling author of Good to Go, What the Athlete in All of Us Can Learn from the Strange Science of Recovery, Christie Aschwanden, on this, an expert edition. If you missed last week's episode of the show, it was a featured performer episode featuring Australian distance running rising star and pacemaker for Eliud Kipchoge's historic 1:59 challenge sub-2-hour marathon run, Jack Rayner. Here's a little snippet of what you missed.
Half the battle of running distance events would be in your mind. So I'd say, I don't know how he's done it, but he's just so much stronger than a lot of people think. Yeah, and he really believes in himself. And it just shows through his running that he doesn't stutter or fall at any point through the marathon. And not all people have that ability. I'd say Eliud is just a standout.
To enjoy the full episode where Jack outlines behind the scenes of his role in the Ineos 1:59 challenge, jump over to wherever it is that you enjoy your podcast from, and whilst there, peruse the archives of the show dating right back to episode 1 featuring surf lifesaving Ironman champion Ali Day. For now, let's jump back with Christie Aschwanden, New York Times best-selling author, on this, an exploration of the strange science of recovery.
Christie, every guest issues listeners with a physical challenge for the week. So what is Christie Aschwanden, New York Times best-selling author of Good to Go's physical challenge for the week going to be?
So my challenge is going to be probably much different than what any of your other guests have done, and that is I'm going to challenge your listeners to make sleep a priority for the next week, to try and add an extra hour of sleep to every night for the next week and see how much it changes the way they're feeling and their workouts and their training and their performance.
Practical and, dare I say, powerful as well. Christie Aschwanden, thank you for your contribution, the hours devoted to this publication, and what a fantastic read. If we want to find out more about you, your work, pick up a copy of Good to Go, where can you direct us?
Yeah, my website for the book is www.goodtogobook.com. My personal website is my name, ChristieAschwanden.com. If you Google it, it'll probably even the misspellings will send you to the right spot. On Twitter, I am Crag Crest. That's CragCrest, like craggy crest. It's the my favorite trail run out here in Colorado. Yeah, and those are good places to find me. And I also I should mention, I am the co-host of a podcast called Emerging Form, which is about the creative process. But it's amazing to me how many parallels that there are in the sporting process too. So something else for your listeners to check out.
And we'll link all that up in the show notes. And, Alex Hutchinson, acclaimed author of Endure, featured guest of the show, commented, "This is the most important book about training you'll read this year." And I have to agree. So, Christie, thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.
So there you have it. And I trust and I know that you enjoyed and took a lot from Christie's sharings around this topic of the strange science of recovery. Now, please do two things. There's someone that you know who will enjoy this in your training circle. Please take a moment to share the episode and the learnings with them. Secondly, do yourself a favour, jump over to wherever books are sold, or Christie's website, goodtogobook.com, and pick up your copy of Good to Go. As I mentioned at the top of the show, this is one of my most enjoyable reads around sports science for a very long time. The amount of work that Christie put into producing this book, as you heard, greater than 230 interviews of leading experts worldwide, is absolutely staggering. Over 1,000 research papers sit behind this body of work. For all the links, be sure to jump over to the show notes over at pogophysio.com.au. A massive thanks to those who are leaving ratings and reviews for the show over on iTunes. They are always a whole lot of fun to read. They are great feedback and great fuel and motivation for myself and the team in bringing the show to you. If you would like to leave a review of the show, it would be enormously appreciated. You can do that over at iTunes. Also consider, if you are yet to do so, hitting the subscribe button from whatever the platform is that you enjoy the show from. That is actually the best way to help the show grow. So thank you for hitting subscribe if you have been enjoying the show. The show is released every Thursday evening, and subscribing just ensures it gets into your device's feed and then also into your earbuds. A massive thanks to the great folk who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, Matthew Olding on all things show graphic design, and Oliver Crossley assisting behind the scenes. Another enormous thank you to today's show sponsor, PhysioCrem. PhysioCrem is the cream of choice at Pogo Physio. And don't forget, you can enjoy 20% off all products over at physiocrem.com.au. Don't forget to keep the podsies coming. That's simply a screenshot of the episode you're enjoying and tagging in the show at Physical Performance Show, and also myself at Brad_Beer. They are such fun to see them coming through, so please consider a podsie. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we will share with you a conversation with a featured performer, UK-based ultra trail running sensation, 4th place getter in Western States, Tom Evans. Tom will share around the highs, lows, and learnings of his career, survive a physical performance round, and issue, as always, from the featured performers, a physical challenge for the week. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.